So welcome everyone to this webinar, Encouraging Active Transportation for Children. Parachute is hosting this for Safe Kids Week. And this year, Safe Kids Week is focused on walking, biking, and wheeling, an initiative to make the road safer so every child can walk, cycle, or wheel to encourage mental, physical, social, emotional well-being. Now more than ever, those of us working in public health are looking at the intersections amongst variables in children's health and safety to provide better options for children to actively travel around. Road safety, physical, mental health, and the environment improve when we reduce motor vehicle traffic through strategies such as improved access to public transit, dedicated bike infrastructure, walkable and connected neighborhoods, and slower, more controlled traffic. Increases in active and multimodal transportation in urban communities can contribute to a reduction in air pollution, greenhouse gas emissions, and noise pollution, which affect the overall health and well-being of communities, both locally and globally. These intersections are reflected and highlighted in both the Global Decade of Action for Road Safety and in UNICEF's most recent report card. This report card examines the state of children and youth's well-being across higher income countries, providing comparisons and ranking for each country based on a number of indicators. This year, the report card focused on environmental indicators and how these impact children and youth's health and well-being. Surprisingly, maybe, is that Canada only ranks 28th amongst 39 rich countries in the overall environmental well-being of children and youth. So this is a very important topic. I'd like to thank Desjardins Insurance, whose generous support enables us to provide events like this webinar. And today I'm pleased to say that we have three excellent speakers to address different aspects of active transportation for children. So let me introduce our first speaker, Dr. Lee Vanderloo, who received her PhD in health promotion from the University of Western Ontario in 2016. Dr. Vanderloo's area of research focuses on the objective measurement of young children's physical activity levels and sedentary time. Her research interests also extend to knowledge translation and implementation science. Currently, Dr. Vanderloo is working as the scientific director at Participation and recently completed her research fellowship at Sick Kids Hospital in Toronto, where her research examined the association between physical activity and sedentary time with various health outcomes in young children, namely mental health and cardiometabolic risk. So welcome, Lee, and I will hand the mic over to you for the first presentation.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Pam. I really appreciate the opportunity to be here and to present a little bit about the benefits of physical activity. So I'm just gonna start sharing my screen. Ooh, it's hiding. Okay. And we will get into, okay. So I'm going to take just the next 10 minutes just to look at a little bit closely of what active transportation is and why it's important for children and youth health. So probably not anything new to the people around this table, but a bit of a brief in terms of from the terminology and the perspective that I'll be presenting from is we typically define participation, that active transportation is really just using your own power to get from one place to another. So examples could be walking, biking, skateboarding, using a non-mechanized wheelchair, even, during the winter time, we can think about snowshoeing or cross-country skiing. So really just anything where we're going to be using our own body to get from point A to point B. The benefits of active transportation are numerous, and Pam, briefly already named a couple of them. So we can look at from, a health perspective, whether it's health of the individual or an even greater number from a population or community health perspective, and definitely some societal benefits, our transportation system, as well as the environment and overall economy. And this is because active transportation gives us the opportunity to be physically active. It also allows us the opportunity to get exposure to natural sunlight, being outdoors, which has, impacts on our moods as well. It's accessible to all and increases social exchanges. So particularly after the past 2 years with COVID, this is certainly an area that we did try to leverage greatly in terms of having that time to be outdoors and connecting with others. It can be one mechanism to help reduce road congestion, contribute to the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, and also can help save money on gas and parking, which depending on where you're located across the country, but particularly in Toronto, and I think gas prices are kind of hitting everyone, is that this is definitely, an added bonus as well. So if we're going to take a little bit of a deeper dive at looking at, well, what are the benefits specific to children and youth? So looking at that kind of pediatric and adolescent population. And so again, pretty numerous, but just unpacking some of the recent stuff from the literature is that we know when kids are outdoors, they tend to move more and play longer. They spend less time being sedentary. It's longer time away from screens. And because of this, we're likely to see an increased chance of having improved cholesterol levels, blood pressure, body composition. So thinking of like those cardiometabolic risk factors, improved bone density, cardiorespiratory and muscular fitness markers, and certainly some aspects of mental, social, and environmental health. Specifically looking at, having an active commute to and from school, where you definitely have seen an increase in kids being able to meet the national physical activity guidelines, which in Canada is about 60 minutes of moderate to vigorous physical activity per day. We also note that children have improved markers of symptoms related to mental health, happiness and well-being, and also contributes to better academic performance. So a decrease in chance of making mistakes on academic outcomes. They perform faster, memory recall and information retention is good, and so is problem solving, and then inductive and deductive thinking. The more that children are able to walk and wheel in their neighborhoods, it gives them a chance to not only familiarize themselves with their settings, but also to develop confidence and independence as they create opportunities and learn to valuable lessons with regards to, safely navigating their neighborhoods, as well as, engaging in, independent ambulation with regards to, understanding the kind of rules of the road and kind of that tacit knowledge. We also know that more students and families walking or wheeling to school makes everyone easier to see and puts more eyes on the road with regards to safety, or at least that's been something that has been cited in the literature. The more people we have out on the roads, it doesn't create just a little bit more, eyes on the road. It also helps if we're doing more of this, especially around the school setting. It does provide opportunities for fewer cars around the schools. So this not only helps reduce traffic congestion, improve safety, but also decreases harmful air pollution, particularly in our concentrated area where we have a lot of young ones around. So just a bit of information in terms of, what are the current stats? The participation report card is essentially a synthesis that's released every 2 years. And it's really just, as I mentioned, a summary or synthesis of the best available research, typically drawn on objective studies, really looking at, what is that best available evidence? What is the state of, various sources of influence with regards to children's movement behaviors, and specifically looking at a number of different indicators from the micro to the macro level that impact whether or not children are more or less active. And so active transportation is certainly one of those areas. So in the 2020 report card, active transportation received a grade of D-. So the data that was used would have been just on the cusp of before the pandemic started. So drawing on information from CFLRI, as well as Statistics Canada. So the Canadian Community Health the Community Health Measures Survey, as well as the Canadian Health Measures Survey. And so they received a grade of D-. And the reason for this is that based on parent and self-report data in 5 to 19-year-olds in Canada, only about 21% use active modes of transportation on a regular basis. 63 rely on inactive modes, such as a car or a bus, and 16% use a combination of active and inactive modes of transportation to travel to and from school. So if we're thinking of that hierarchy from best to maybe less best, definitely using full active transportation is going to give you the most benefits, but even employing some active and inactive, or this mixed mode of transportation. So if you're someone who, maybe your child takes the public transportation, for example, so at least you do get some walking or wheeling to and from the transit stops. And that can also be a great option depending on where you're living in proximity to school, for example. For the report card, for every indicator, we do come up with a set of research gaps as well as practice and policy gaps. And the team that devises these particular recommendations or gaps is a team of about 20 researchers, as well as public health officials and government representatives as well. So we have a pretty rounded out group from across the country. So in terms of research, some questions to ask in terms of helping to up this grade is, how frequently do children and youth engage in active transportation to and from destinations other than school? The majority of information we do have is just looking at the school commute. And so it'd be good to know, as well as other ways that they're engaging in active transportation. We can consider employing more objective measures of active transportation, such as using GPS or GIS. Active school travel intervention research is needed in Canada that includes appropriate time for follow-up. So again, most of the studies we have are not of a longitudinal nature. And so we probably want to start looking for that just so we can really see some of that more habitual changes. Think about other ways that we can really, as I mentioned, implement mixed modes of transportation. So that might be a really great way that we can ensure that kids are at least getting kind of micro opportunities to accumulate more minutes towards their national or their daily goal of meeting 60 minutes of physical activity per day. Some other recommendations, and these are again from a policy or research or practice perspective, is consider letting children walk or bike or cycle to destinations that are within a few kilometers of home, whether it be school, to a friend's house, a nearby park. Create a culture of active transportation similar to many European and African nations. So this has also been solicited from some of the work we've been doing with the Global Matrix that involves carrying out this report card with about 63 other countries. And again, very different reasons for why we're seeing such a high adoption of active transportation in Europe versus countries in Africa. However, these are great ways to see that this is it's more of a cultural norm, more of a social norm, where active transportation is just part of everyday living. So how can we bring some of those lessons and apply them into countries such as Canada? Increase traffic control and supervision to help facilitate active transportation for children and youth. This has again come up not only if we look at some of the medical literature, but also at some of the child and family literature as well, in terms of having that fear, risky play literature as well. So looking how can we address some of those concerns. Other examples we've seen that have been successful across the country are ideas such as, using walking school buses. So again, there's that safety of doing it in numbers, but we are looking at still employing, our own bodies to get from point A to point B. Just as, wrapping things up, well, what's new and what does this mean for Canada in terms of, where does active transportation fall? Well, very recently, for the first time ever in June 2021, the Government of Canada did announce its first ever approach for promoting active transportation by releasing a national active transportation strategy. So this is huge for Canada because we've never had that. And it really does help elevate and prioritize the importance that this will have. Now, most of the funds available are to help support infrastructure, but really it's this kind of recognition at a national or federal level that active transportation is really vital to our society on a number of different reasons, not just health, but also looking at ways that it helps support our economy, tourism, as well as from a pollution perspective, which is very big and in line with the UN's SDGs, so social development goals, specifically looking at ones that support, mitigating impacts on climate change. So in closing, when you're looking for ways to help build active transportation into your life or to those of the children in your life, it's really trying to get outside and finding ways to engage with your community in a number of different, from a number of different approaches, using whether it's, a bike, whether you're walking, wheeling, and trying to make this just a normal part of day-to-day life. Think twice about using your car for every trip. Is there an opportunity that you can engage in active transportation instead, particularly, now that the weather is getting warmer in many parts of Canada, though I would argue that, we are used in Canada having that snow, and so just trying to take advantage of, being outdoors and utilizing active transportation throughout the year where it's possible. And of course, when it's not extreme heat advisories or freezing, wind chill warnings. Try to find ways that if you can't commute actively all the way to between, point A and point B, is there a way that you can do it part way? So again, leveraging that mixed modes of transportation. When you're taking your kids to different outings, is there an opportunity where you can actively get there? Set aside a bit more time, because it is going to take in some cases, it might take a little bit more time depending on the ages of your children, but, make that part of your bonding time of spending time together. And then, really take an audit in terms of, the most frequently visited places that you go to. How far are they? And does it make sense that sometimes, we're actually going to try to find a way to actively commute there? If you're trying to build that culture within, the school, the workplace, public health, or even within your community setting, is really trying to leverage all the ways that physical activity can benefit us, not only from a health perspective, but also looking at the health from, better social cohesion, group dynamics, as well as, improved or a more positive impact on the environment and lowering our carbon footprint. So usually if you talk about the wide variety of positives that active transportation brings above and beyond, it's just good for you, usually you'll be able to kind of, tweak someone's interest and maybe motivate them to want to engage in more active modes of transportation for those other reasons. So again, there are a lot of different opportunities that are available. These are just some questions in terms of trying to think about, what that might mean for you or your family or children that you're working with. But essentially, that is the end of my presentation. I don't want to go over time. If you do have any questions, never hesitate to reach out. My email here, Twitter's here, or you can visit our website at participaction.com. And we have a lot of great resources, both in French and English, that talk a little bit more about active transportation and unpack it from various different facets of health. So thank you very much for your time.
Thanks so much, Lee. That was great. Lots of information. And I know there is a ton of information on the Participaction website. Before we go any further, I did neglect to mention that if you had any issues with how the webinar is working, please put that in the chat function. And we invite you all to enter any of questions that you have for our panelists in the Q&A section, and we have set aside some time at the end to address those. So it's my pleasure to introduce our second speaker, Dr. Alison McPherson, who is a professor in the School of Kinesiology and Health Science at York University and an adjunct senior scientist at ICES. Her research is related to keeping kids active, healthy, and safe, and focuses on the prevention of childhood injuries, primarily through policies and laws designed to reduce injuries. So over to you, Alison.
Thank you. Okay, just checking in, Pam, what's the view? Can you see it?
It hasn't switched over to presentation yet.
I'm gonna have to do it like this.
Yeah, and then do
the switch view, right?
Yeah. There you go. Great,
oh,
perfect.
Thanks. Sorry about that. I don't know why it's doing that. So
no worries.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this webinar. And it's hard to believe how many years I've been participating in Safe Kids Week. I shudder to think. So I'm Alison McPherson, and I would like to acknowledge my co-author, Dr. Sarah Richmond from Public Health Ontario. And so the talk today is factors associated with active transport and motor vehicle collisions in children, findings from the CHASE study, which is a large pan-Canadian study. This is just a list of the partners on the CHASE study. There are 4 PIs, including Pam Fuselli, myself, and Andrew Howard from Sick Kids, and Brent Hagel from University of Calgary. So it's a very big, very involved study. So I'll go over a few things first, brief methods. So factors associated with active transportation, measured using observation at schools. And I love that Dr. Vanderloo pointed out that that's not the only way and time that kids are active. But we use that method. Factors associated with pedestrian and cyclist collisions, police reported data. Features of the built environment that increase active transportation and reduce collisions, which was measured by observation and mapping, and barriers and enablers to changes to the built environment from interviews and focus groups with stakeholders. So my next slide it's sort of the conceptual framework of this study. And so we know that the built environment supports active travel. Increasing safety increases active travel. The built environment reduces risk. And so the 3 objectives there include the final one, which is integrated knowledge translation and built environment planning. And that's kind of a fancy way of saying we really worked in partnership with the cities, with the city of Vancouver, Calgary, Toronto, and Montreal, and really asked people, you know, what would make you change the built environment to make it more friendly for children to walk and bike to school and around, but we focused on the school trip. So we developed these, what we call infographics, and these were developed for our city partners. So the one I'm going to show you is the built environment and active transportation safety in Toronto, which is where I live, and they were a very, very involved partner in this study. So first we looked at the active school transportation, which includes, as Dr. Vanderloo said, walking, biking, riding. And across Toronto, 65% of children use some form of AST. But AST was reported as high as 99% in some schools and as low as 24% in others. And that variability is a bit, well, it's sad, especially for the ones where only 1 in 4 children use active transport, but it also will give us some information about what factors are associated with having more kids walk and ride to school. So in our studies, what factors increase or decrease AST? Areas where there were more children had more AST. Areas with higher walk scores were associated with more AST. And walk score is just a globally used measure of walkability, you know, and how friendly is the environment to walk in. Areas with adult crossing guards were associated with more AST. Areas with more traffic signals also, and areas with more local roads. And I think that those are important because those are easy to change elements of the built environment. And you can see that little speed limit 30 sign that we put there. Local roads have lower speed limits, and what we call arterial roads have higher speed limits. So we'll talk a bit more about that later. So in Toronto specifically, areas with more children were associated with more AST, areas with more intersections, and sort of paradoxically, areas with more traffic calming devices were associated with less AST. And one thing I'd like to point out there is in the city of Toronto, the traffic calming is much more implemented in wealthier neighborhoods. So in wealthier neighborhoods, the houses tend to be farther apart. They tend to be pretty car friendly. And they tend to have more traffic calming. So we'll get into this a little bit later, a bit more, but really traffic calming and built environment, it's an equity issue. So if you live in a tall apartment building beside an arterial road, you can think about Jane and Finch where York University is located, and you don't have a car, you're automatically exposing your children to a more dangerous road environment that you don't have the possibility to change. So this is a map of pedestrian and cyclist motor vehicle collisions and active transportation. So I know it's a bit small, but I wanted you to be able to see the whole city. So those dots represent the schools that we did observations at. And the ones that are lighter, like white and light gray, had lower rates of active transportation. And the ones that are darker had higher rates. And then the red and yellow and blue overlaid over that is the density of child and pedestrian and bicycle collisions over an 8-year period. So we can see a lot of the collisions are centered in downtown Toronto, which has probably got something to do with density. But there's also, we're seeing on a more recent study that we're getting some more hotspots in up in Northwest Toronto and also in the east in Scarborough. So that's where the equity issue really emerges. So what factors increase or decrease collisions? So more children were associated with more collisions. Again, that might be a density issue. Areas with a larger new immigrant population were associated with more collisions, and I think that's probably the equity issue. Areas with adult crossing guards were associated with more collisions. And I think the reason for that is really where we place our adult crossing guards is either where there's been a collision or where the road traffic environment is dangerous. So it's not actually the adult crossing guards, but it's more the road design. Low-income neighborhoods were associated with more collisions, and this is true in every single city, and it's really important to note that. And areas with more roads were associated with more collisions. Areas with more housing were associated with less collisions, as opposed to like industrial land or things. More parks, less collisions. And areas with more older housing built prior to 1960 were also associated with less collisions. And that too is probably a proxy for the road environment, because in areas where the houses were built over 100 years ago, the streets are narrower because they weren't really designed for cars. They weren't, freeways. They were designed for just horses and wagons and other things. So that finding makes sense. So in Toronto, things that increase collisions are areas with more children, areas with adult crossing guards, and areas with more roads. And the thing that really decreased collisions in Toronto was areas with more parks. So changing the built environment increased AST and reduced collisions. So we asked a whole bunch of stakeholders. We asked people in public health. We asked people in transport. We asked non-governmental organizations that promote active transport. And we asked, what are the facilitators and what are the barriers? So the facilitators were cross-sectional collaboration. If public health and transport work together, that seems to be a much more successful model. Data sharing. And I have to say that in the city of Toronto, the city has been very generous with data sharing with our research team and allowing us to do a lot of these studies in a cost-effective way. Vision Zero, and I'm assuming everybody's heard of Vision Zero, but if you haven't, it's a movement to have a vision of cities where people can walk and bike and there will be zero people hit by cars or dying in a car. And community consultation. The barriers, I guess the first one should be no surprise, motor vehicle prioritization. If we design our cities so that they are optimally gotten around in a car, that's always going to be a barrier to AST. Lack of funding and resources was another important barrier that, my pet peeve in Toronto, we spend millions on the Gardiner Highway through the center of our city, but we can't put a stop sign or a speed camera in. Existing infrastructure, the roads are already designed as arterial roads. And so that makes a lot of residents are resistant to change and to having the traffic slowed down, especially residents that go through a neighborhood rather than living in. So I think one of the bottom line is decision makers need to consider equity in road safety planning and to use evidence to make decisions. And once our roads are more equitable, they will for sure be more safe. So I just wanted to say thanks to the entire Chase team, to say thanks to Lisa Liu, who's an MPH intern who did these wonderful infographics. And thanks for my tax funding and all of the municipalities who were so generous with their resources and their time. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Allison. Yeah, and even if we are a driver, everyone's a pedestrian at some point. So we have to, I think the mindset of changing our approach to whose roadway is it, and how do we use it is really important. So our third speaker is Suzanne Benno, who is a pediatric emergency medicine specialist and medical co-director for trauma at the Hospital for Sick Children. She's the Sick Kids site lead for TREC and chair of the Injury Prevention Committee for the Canadian Pediatric Society. Dr. Benno's professional interests focus on continuing advancement and improvement of pediatric trauma care and injury prevention through medical education, quality improvement initiatives, research, public awareness, and advocacy. And it's been my pleasure to work with Sue for a number of years. So I will hand the mic over to you. I think you have a lot of interesting things to share with us.
Thank you, Pam, for the introduction. Thanks for the invite to be part of this. And thank you to my two co-presenters who are working so hard to make my job easier. So I will, oops, I'll just back it up here. There we go. Can everybody see that okay?
It's great.
Okay, great. So I'm going to look at it through a different lens, and that would be the clinical lens. And so, you know, as an emergency physician and a trauma director, this is sort of the part of active transportation that I sometimes see on this end. So we'll just bring that forward to you. I have no actual or potential conflicts of interest here. And the objectives are really to kind of look at pediatric trauma frontline perspective on this issue, some of the local epidemiology that we have here, and of course the impact that this has on children and families and staff as well. So kids, you know, they're little buggers. I mean, they do a lot of stuff. They are constantly active, and they tend to get hurt. And trauma is not uncommon. Injury is quite common, makes up about 20 to 25% of the visits that we see in our emergency department. And about 80% or so of the trauma activations that we see in our trauma center are due to blunt trauma. Or more, and intentional violence, which is something that used to be really unheard of to be seen at sick kids, is now actually escalating in numbers as well, but still under 10% or so. So just to give you some frame of reference right now, the number of trauma team activations that we see in our trauma center at Sick Kids is about 200 or so per year. And so those are children who, through field trauma triage criteria, are designated to have a significant enough injury that they would require a structured team that is ready when they arrive for a rapid assessment for management to make sure that you know, they get the best outcome that they can through efficient and effective care. I had our trauma registry analyst pull some of the data for the last 3 years in terms of how many pedestrian injuries we're seeing and how many cyclist injuries we're seeing. And it was interesting. So pedestrians make up around 15 to 30% of our total trauma activation volume. And it's no surprise that it is highest in the ages of 5 to 14 years of age. And that in 2019, 2020, that fiscal year, the youngest of our cohorts, 0 to 4 years, was actually quite overrepresented. And I'm not entirely sure why, but I will say that through that year as well, the mean injury severity score was significantly increased. And I think this reflects really the vulnerability of young children to this type of injury. In regards to cyclists, cyclists make up about 10% of the entire trauma activations that we see, but I will say that they're increasing in frequency. And I'll show you this slide here, which is essentially a study that members of our division at Sick Kids through Emergency Medicine and through CHIRP did when they looked at bike-related emergency room visits through the pandemic and compared that to pre-pandemic. So when everybody was out buying a trampoline and children were out cycling more, that was anecdotally noticed across the country. And we certainly saw that as well. And their data really reflects, if you see that gray line there, that's the pandemic, and they measured from March to October of 2020 and compared that to March to October of 2019 and 2018. And you can see about a threefold increase actually in cycling injuries that occurred during that time. So it was borne out in research as well as anecdote. But interestingly, what we saw is really that while the rates went up, the severity didn't. So most of these children actually had lower severity scores, were seen in the emergency department, and were discharged home. And that was reflected as well in our trauma registry. So when we think of kids and we think of injury, we often think of them as sort of resilient gumbo dolls that bounce back. And that is often true, for sure. I mean, they really, they can withstand sometimes more force than we can, given their developing body. On the other hand, children are actually uniquely disadvantaged when it comes to injury for a number of reasons. Developmentally, they're more prone to being injured, and their size and other anatomic features, as well as their physiology, puts them at risk for increased stress and increased multi-system injury. And it just again reiterates that point of how vulnerable young children are to significant force on their bodies. So when we have a child like this, those of us, everybody in the injury prevention realm is kind of like, ooh, what's missing here? So when you see this child and you think, what could potentially happen to him if this child fell off his bike or if he was hit by a car? Well, there's a number of things, but probably the most likely thing, as opposed to, or as, consistent with kind of the injury pyramid that we see, is that he's likely to have soft tissue injuries. He's likely to have cuts and scrapes and bumps to the head, extremity injuries. This is certainly what makes up the bulk of what we see for bicycle-related injuries in our emergency department. And these kids generally do very well and are going home. But there's a couple things about him. We notice that he's not wearing a helmet, that he's kind of isolated. There aren't a lot of other kids or people around him. Potentially, who knows if there's any traffic measures, stop signs, what have you, or what speeds vehicles are going down that road. He may not be so lucky. And it is possible that he could end up having quite a devastating head injury, thoracoabdominal trauma, multi-system injury, from which the consequences are grave, significant, and the recovery road is a lot more complex. So, when I asked our trauma coordinator before, in terms of, while I was preparing for this, in terms of what her thoughts were on how these kids are when they go home, in terms of the impact that they have, really what she said was 3 words, and that was changed for life. And whether it's cognitive challenges, movement issues, psychological stress, essentially what's interesting about this paper is it's a survey done in the UK at a major trauma center, and it interviewed about 32 people, so 16 children and 16 parents, about their impact of their injury. And it's one paper that's published that doesn't focus exclusively on traumatic brain injury, which most of this research does, but it really took into account any child who left a major trauma center 6 to 18 years of age. And what they found was that injured children struggled with changes to their appearance, physical activity restrictions, and late onset physical symptoms, which developed after hospital discharge when activity levels increased. Social participation was affected by activity restrictions, concerns about their appearance, interruptions to friendships. And psychological impacts, particularly post-traumatic stress type symptoms, often affected both children and parents. And parents' responsibilities suddenly increased, which affected family relationships and roles, their ability to work and carry out daily tasks. And while rapid hospital discharge was wanted, meaning everybody wanted to get back to their own bed and try to normalize their life, participants often felt very vulnerable when they went home. And they valued that continued contact with the healthcare professional and practical support supports from family and friends, which enabled resumption of their usual lives. And if you read through this article, there's a number of vignettes and quotes directly from children and parents who have gone through this, and it's quite a moving piece, actually. So just in summary, a very brief summary from this vantage point is that 100% children must stay active. However, serious injury with lifelong consequences following cycling and pedestrian motor vehicle collisions is not insignificant, and they can and should be prevented. And so all that research that's being done and societal efforts to improve safety through a thoughtful built environment and infrastructure is really key in allowing this healthy development to occur while reducing injury trauma rates. And so it's not so much as a balance between activity and injury, but more of this symbiotic effect where we can do both together. And so that's it, all I have. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks, Sue. I'll invite Allison and Lee to rejoin us for the question and answer. We have a couple of questions from participants, and I have a couple that have come up. But I think, Sue, that your last point really summed it up. That I think that the importance of activity, of physical activity, of being able to be out there doing things that you love, like cycling and biking and wheeling on various machines, that we have to encourage that, but we can't do that at the cost of the potential for these serious injuries, especially to children. And when you think about some of the size of the vehicles, we know some vehicle manufacturers are no longer even making cars, that they're small, as you said in your presentation, they're small stature, that just as the vehicle size increases, the impact zone becomes more and more critical for those kids. So let me go to the questions, and I will maybe address this first one, Allison, to you. The first question is, what are some recommendations for rural communities to encourage active transportation when the distance is a barrier? Maybe, Allison, I'll start with you, and then maybe Lee, you wanted to jump in there.
I think the infrastructure there is even more important because rural areas tend to have those wider, fast roads. And I know in other countries, such as Finland, if they have a rural road, they have a rural bike path that's physically separated by quite a distance from the road. And so I think it really is all about infrastructure. And bikes can take you far, and especially e-bikes, if people have mobility issues, can really go. So I think it's not so much the distance, it is as this feeling of safety. I mean, of course, not everybody can just start biking 25, 30 kilometers right off the bat. But I think what Dr. Vanderloo said was so important, make it in your lifestyle, bike wherever you can, walk wherever you can. And then if you can't, then use other modes of transportation. But I really do think that my experience in rural parts of Ontario is that the cycling infrastructure tends to be fairly poor, and much of it is right beside cars and big trucks. And, I've ridden by a big truck on a rural road, and it's terrifying to me. So I think that if I had a separated bike lane, I would have biked more. So I think that would be my biggest thing. And also perhaps more of the sort of traffic calming, stoplights, stop signs, things like that may not seem necessary, but would really help give cyclists and walkers a greater sense of safety. Great.
Lee, did you want to add anything to that?
I think Dr. McPherson did a really nice job at providing a nice overview, and probably most of the same things I would have said in terms of infrastructure. I think the other thing I would maybe add is just around what's the social climate within these particular communities, and has that changed? I think over time, I think it wasn't uncommon that we would see a lot of people, kids walking together or even cycling in some of these smaller rural communities or rural towns. But there has been a decline. And I know in BC particularly, they've spent a lot of time actually investigating this and looking at, why are we starting to see these trends? And a lot of it has to do with just that social climate. There's been shifts in terms of the type of industry that might have been more popular in those particular communities at one point, no longer there. If they are kind of newer, continuing to grow, communities, that's another reason why, that infrastructure might not yet be there. And another thing from that social perspective is it something valued? If it is, you look at other really small rural towns, like most of my family are from, a small village in Holland. And so they also live in a rural area, but it's just understood that there will always be bikes on the road. So when you have the transport trucks, they live. So my family owns, surprise, a tulip farm out there, but so they have the transport trucks all the time carrying huge bulbs all throughout their city or their small town. And so it's not uncommon that you're going to be riding side by side with these transport trucks. But the fact is that they do have designated bike lanes, and not just with a painted line, but actually raised kind of scalloped edges. And that is not only gives them that sense of security to the cyclist, but to the driver as well, is that they will physically feel if they've ever wavered over the barrier. And so I think there's just this understanding that we share the road with pedestrians, as well as cyclists, for example. And so I think there's just that mutual understanding, that expectation of it is just like another way for us to get from point A to point B, and that we're not just solely relying on cars. And so I think that's something that we're starting to see more, and I am starting to see in the literature just more studies undertaking, what is it specific to rural communities that's going to either predict or encourage or hinder whether we adopt more active transportation, because the majority of the learning that we know to date is more from urban settings or from suburban settings.
Right. Yeah. And Lee, your audio is a little bit there's
Choppy?
some background or kind of wobbling, but anyways,
Oh,
I think we got the gist of it. Absolutely. Sue, and in your experience, when you do see kids in the ER or the ED, do you see a difference between those that come in from an urban versus rural? I know you would get some of the more serious traumas at Sick Kids, but
that's a great question. I mean, certainly we probably, at this point, about half of our traumas come straight from scene and half would come from another hospital, because we have a lot of community hospitals that do a lot of great work within the GTA and regionally. The children who end up coming to us who have been in a rural area, who would have gone to a community hospital first, or who would have come through Orange, for example, to come to us, will be more severely injured from the setting of a bicycle or being hit by a car in that regard, I guess, because by nature, the fact that they're coming our way already means that they have significant injuries. In the urban environment, though, it can just happen too. I mean, really, I can't even stress enough the fact that their physical stature, how small they are, the way energy dissipates across their bodies, the fact that they have multi-system injuries, so head injuries, chest, abdomen injuries, loss of extremity fractures, they're small and it's a large unit force. And so when they are hit, they tend to have quite significant injuries. So we have seen terrible injuries in the urban setting. We've seen terrible injuries in the rural setting as well. So I'm not sure if that absolutely answers the question, but we see that both. Yeah.
Yeah. No, that's great. And, we don't often hear from, physicians, when prevention doesn't work, that, what you are seeing. And I think that just makes it even more important for us on the prevention side to do the work that we're doing and to really, put those things into place, interventions into place that are effective, while not restricting the activity that we want to see. Allison, I have a question about why do you think that the presence of more parks reduces collisions? Do kids take routes through parks and that's away from roadways? Do you think it's because in the park area, like there's less vehicles? Is it an exposure issue?
Yeah, I think there's a multitude of reasons. I think, yes, people can certainly bike through the park, and that's much safer, especially if the park doesn't have any cars in it. But even if it does, the cars tend to be going slower and expecting to see cyclists. I also think that we're more likely to have the bigger, older parks in wealthier neighborhoods. And I think that that also is an equity issue, that, you know, they have the traffic calming, they have the parks, they have kind of that package that makes it safer to walk and bike around. I mean, I know we found that, and I think it's important, but I think it's also important to note, like where I live, which is near High Park in Toronto, there's an arterial road right beside the park with no sidewalks, and it's had numerous fatalities and all kinds of collisions between cars, to pedestrians, to bikes. So it's not just the park itself that makes it protective, I think, but it's the fact that it's networked in a different way, perhaps, than some of the other other places. Like if you have a big factory or you know, a shopping mall, a strip mall, those sorts of things, I don't think those would be successful in slowing the traffic down.
And I guess to me, it really speaks to that, you know, the impact that the built environment has, how important that is from a systems level, that doesn't require, or it directs behavior of the road users in such a way that it makes it, you know, more safer, and prevents more of the serious and fatal injuries. There's a question about the areas also with more traffic calming devices that were associated with less active transportation. So the question is, I understand it's an equity issue, but can you please unpack it a little more?
Sure, I'll do my very best. So if you, and I didn't bring a slide with this on it, but my colleague, Dr. Linda Rothman, did a study looking at where traffic calming was installed in the city of Toronto. And it was installed in the areas that tended to have, you know, single family homes, treed streets, and you're not allowed to install traffic calming on an arterial road in the city of Toronto. So Jane, Finch, Steeles, Keele, all of those streets are not allowed to have any traffic calming installed on them. So the combination of living in an area where you can afford a single family home, you can probably afford a car, and you know, you could drive to the park safely to ride your bike there. Not that I'm recommending that at all. And I think Dr. Vanderloo's point was well made. And so along the arterial roads, there tends to be more dense housing, apartment buildings, and things like that. So it really is about where people live and what services they have access to, and where we care that the streets aren't safe. And I think that that whole concept of caring is really, really important. And I know Toronto now has an equity officer in their transportation division, so I'm really hopeful that that will change. But I think we really have to, as long as you get people who need to advocate to get traffic calming put on the streets where they're allowed to put it, it's never going to be equitably distributed across the city. Great question. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely.
They're all great questions. And the chat is really nice. I'm looking at some of the comments in the chat. It's really good.
Yeah, very engaged, which is great. And Lee, maybe you can talk a little bit about this. Actually, all of you may have an answer or a thought on this question around, you know, the social climate. How do we create buy-in from communities, businesses, city governments, to create that sort of universal design, that cycling infrastructure and pedestrian infrastructure that we need? I know all of you have done you know, work in policy and advocated and worked with folks who do. So I'd be interested in your thoughts, but Lee, I'll start with you.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. I think one of the first things that I would do in terms of is that it's not necessarily a one size fit all solution. What works in maybe rural BC or, you know, Calgary might not be the same for, some Northern Ontario community. And so I think what would be important is to really conduct some sort of needs assessment, or to figure out what are the needs of this community? What are their wants? I think as a researcher, I might have ideas on what I think would work, but it really ultimately has to be up to the community in terms of what that's going to help with buy-in. If I come in and apply some sort of solution that I think would work, if there's no buy-in there, it gets really tricky in terms of having it be actually adopted and, implemented as intended. I also previously mentioned in terms of, because there are so many benefits for active transportation. I think it's really figuring out, once you kind of know what the main goals or priorities of those kind of communities are, is to try to leverage some of the added benefits. Although, you'd be hard pressed to find anyone that wouldn't want to support, child health and safety. Depending on their specific sector, there's going to be some other drivers or things that they might prioritize higher, such as, maybe increased tourism into some of these towns, commerce having, there's going to be other competing interests. And so, maybe if you're figuring out, it's a little bit more from an environmental perspective or an economic driver, and then maybe really leverage this is why active transportation is going to allow you to get at all of these different things. And, by extension, it's also going to help support, improve safety for kids and, a decrease in emergency room visits. But I think that's what I would do. So start with that needs assessment, figure out what those needs are, and maybe look for, sometimes you're going to have to take that backdoor route in terms of, making, active transportation a little bit more present. But I think one of the big things that we can capitalize on, for putting together, policy briefs, or even, some sort of proposal or application for funding, is really to leverage the idea that this has now been viewed as and prioritized by the national government, by the federal government, and so this is something that's definitely being viewed as a priority, and that it makes sense for us to start trickling down the fact that the higher ups have now we have the buy-in. How can we ensure that it kind of migrates all the way down to the smallest microsystems? So that would be my kind of first things on how maybe I would look at some of the buy-in, but I'd be really interested to hear from the other panelists as well in terms of their suggestions.
I have muted myself. You'd think after all this time I figured this out. Sue, did you have any thoughts on that question? Oh, sorry, we can't hear you.
You would think that no, I don't have anything.
Okay,
about that,
Allison, did you have anything?
I mean, I think that that's exactly what we did in the Chase study, but we didn't do rural communities because it was a Healthy Cities grant. But we really, when we talked to our stakeholders, the intersectoral collaboration, and I think that's what Lee was referring to, is so important. So you can't just have traffic engineers. Like, traffic engineers are amazing and they do a lot of fantastic work, but you need everybody around the table. You need public health. You need some of the non-governmental organizations like Green Cities. So you need to get a whole bunch of people. The other thing that really, really helps that our stakeholders told us, there's two things. One, you need a champion. Somebody has to champion it. And in the city of Montreal, their mayor is a champion, and they have seen so much progress. Their folks in traffic say they can't keep up with the demand to make that city safer. And the other thing I think is it's really important for researchers like us who are looking at these larger questions in the built environment to feed back to the stakeholders that helped us do this research. So that's why we made the infographic that I showed you, so that the city can use that and can feel like, oh, we answered these questions and this is what we found. And, we had all the different data sources of kids walking to school, of kids and cyclists getting hit by cars, and, what the stakeholders told us. And I think it's really important not to just look at this in isolation from one perspective. I think we really have to say we need kids healthy, active, and safe. And we know what we need to do, and we need the infrastructure to do that. And I think Lee mentioned the Sustainable Development Goals earlier. We aren't going to have a climate if we keep focusing our life on our cars. You know, it's not just about, oh, it's nice to go for a bike ride. It's really, we need a modal shift in Canadian cities and even in the countryside. And some of the comments in the chat were so true, you know, close the lakeshore on the weekend, you know, and everybody says, well, traffic's bad. Well, if you're in traffic, you are traffic. So
that's right.
Change your mode of transportation as well, so that families can get out and bike. And the other thing I wanted to say was the getting kids to walk to school early has lifelong benefits because they adapt to that mode of transport and they see biking to school or walking to school as a mode of transport for them to get around. And so it's really important that we make it safe for them to do that and not just say, oh, it's too unsafe, jump in my car and off we go. So that was a bit of a long answer, but
yeah, no, but I mean, ironically, you know, what they think is safer is actually not safer because then, you know, we know that motor vehicle crashes and occupants are really high and they're going to end up in Sue's emergency department. And, you know, when they could have been walking, you know, to school. And I think, Sue, I wrote down exactly what your trauma coordinator said, changed for life. I think that's one of the key takeaways is that you can, and that's in a positive way, you can be changed for life by being able to be active, you know, safe in your environment, but you can also be changed for life if there is an injury. And I think, you know, those of us in prevention know how the truth of the fact that we cannot turn back the hands of time once something happens. It has, you know, it has implications, whether it's, you know, very severe or less severe. Obviously, we're more concerned with the more severe. The comments in the chats have been great, and I know we are wrapping up now. There's a couple of questions about, you know, resources that have been mentioned in the presentations. So we will commit to, when we send out the link to the recording of this presentation, if any of you have links that you can share for resources, we'll include those in the email out to everyone who's registered. And please feel free to share this with anyone in your network. We're happy to do that. And I am to remind you that there is an evaluation at the end of this. So once the webinar stops, you'll get a screen that says some evaluation questions, and we'd be really happy to hear from you. Allison, you have your hand up. One more last question.
Yeah, sorry, I
comment.
was going to say, you know, in the spirit of working in partnership with our cities, we can't share the infographics yet because we haven't got their final sign off. But once we do, we're happy to make them. But, you know, we want to make sure that we were accurately reflecting what they told us and that they're very comfortable with it. So, but parachute.ca has lots of interesting evidence for people who are interested in that. Thanks so much.
So thank you all for, you know, very different but so interconnected presentations from different perspectives. From the chat and from the questions from the audience. I think this has been really valuable, and we really appreciate you taking the time to share this with us, and we will share it out with everyone once the recording has been set up. So Allison, Sue, Lee, thank you so much for being here. And I will wrap up this webinar.